Some encounters are unsettling in the moment, but others stay with you long after they're over. A stranger appearing in the middle of a remote winter forest. A man who seems to show up in different parts of a crowded city without explanation. And a homeowner who slowly realizes that someone has been inside his house while he was sleeping. These are 3 stories about moments when ordinary places suddenly stopped feeling safe. And in each one, the most disturbing part wasn't knowing that something was wrong. It was realizing just how close the danger had already gotten. Let's begin with the first story. I went camping alone one winter with my dog, Roscoe. It was supposed to be a few quiet days away from people, a chance to disappear into the woods, get some fresh air, and clear my head. Instead, it became an experience I know I'll never repeat. I had taken a few days off work, loaded my truck with camping gear, and headed into a state forest along a long, narrow trail. The farther I drove, the more isolated everything became. The road was barely maintained, covered in packed snow and patches of ice, and I didn't see another vehicle the entire way. After nearly an hour, I pulled into a small roadside turnout. It looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. I parked there, grabbed my pack, and started hiking with Roscoe. About 20 minutes later, we reached a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. The snow was deep and completely untouched. There were no footprints, tire tracks, or any other indication that someone had been there recently. That was exactly what I had been looking for. I dropped my pack and started clearing a place for the tent while Roscoe wandered around nearby. He sniffed through the snow, investigated the trees, and occasionally jumped around like he was having the time of his life. Once the tent was up, I secured the stakes as tightly as I could against the frozen ground. I laid out my sleeping pad and winter sleeping bag, knowing the temperature was going to drop well below freezing that night. I had dressed for it, too. Thermal layers, thick socks, a fleece, and a heavy jacket. Then I gathered some dead wood and built a small fire. As the flames settled into a steady burn, I cooked a simple dinner and sat on a log beside Roscoe. He curled up near the warmth while I ate. The forest was unbelievably quiet. Winter does something strange to the woods. Snow seems to swallow every little sound, leaving behind a silence that can feel almost unnatural. My dad had taught me that years ago, and sitting there alone, I understood exactly what he meant. For a while, everything was peaceful. Then Roscoe suddenly stood up. He stared toward the trees and started barking. At first, I didn't think much of it. There were plenty of deer in that area, and Roscoe had reacted to them before. I told him to settle down, and after a minute he did. I checked the time and decided to stay by the fire a little longer before going to bed. I always carried a handgun when camping somewhere that remote. It was holstered at my side, just as it normally was. At that point, I still felt completely safe. About 20 minutes later, Roscoe started barking again. This time, there was something different about it. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Someone or something was moving through the snow somewhere beyond the trees. I stood up and listened. The footsteps stopped. A few seconds passed. Then they started again. Roscoe's barking changed into a low growl, and then, suddenly, he went completely silent. He stood rigid, staring straight toward the tree line. That is when I knew something was wrong. I followed his gaze. At the edge of the trees, barely illuminated by the fire, stood a figure. Someone was watching us. I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. I said he had scared me and reassured Roscoe that everything was okay. The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. It was a man. He looked at me and asked what I was doing so far out in the woods. There was nothing friendly about his tone. I told him I was just camping and spending some time in nature with my dog. He didn't answer. He simply stood there and watched me. Something about the encounter felt wrong, and I could feel my instincts telling me to be careful, so I calmly told him that I was armed. The man gave a slight laugh. Instead of backing away, he made some remark about how I was threatening him rather than inviting him to join me, and questioned where my hospitality was. Then he turned around. Without another word, he walked back into the darkness. I stood there staring after him for a long time. Roscoe stayed right beside me. I didn't like what had just happened, but eventually I convinced myself that the man was gone. I carefully put out the fire, covering it with snow and stirring the ashes until there wasn't even a faint glow left. I didn't want anything from my campsite attracting attention. Then I climbed into the tent and sealed it shut. Roscoe curled up beside me, and his body heat helped keep us warm. I lay there listening to the woods, or, more accurately, listening to the silence. For a while, nothing happened. Then Roscoe started growling again. A moment later, I heard why. Footsteps in the snow, they stopped. Roscoe went quiet, but his ears remained pointed toward the sound. Then the footsteps started again. This time they were closer and slower. They came directly toward the tent. Then stopped. Roscoe suddenly began howling. I whispered for him to be quiet, terrified that he might draw attention to us. Eventually he stopped howling, but he continued to growl under his breath. Someone was standing outside. I could hear tiny movements in the snow, the subtle shifting of someone's weight. By then, I had my gun in my hand. But I didn't want to make another threat, because I wasn't sure what I would do if that person refused to leave. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I cocked the gun. Then I clearly told whoever was outside that I had a firearm and that they needed to leave immediately. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then came the sound of footsteps. They began moving away from the tent. At first, slowly, then faster. Until eventually, the sound disappeared into the woods. I never opened the tent. I didn't unzip it. I didn't look outside. I stayed completely still for hours, with Roscoe remaining alert beside me. When the sky finally started to brighten, I packed everything as quickly as I could. As soon as there was enough daylight, Roscoe and I hiked back to the truck. I drove away and never returned to that part of the forest, and I never planned to. That experience taught me something I probably should have known already. When you are alone in a remote place, you can't afford to let your guard down, because sometimes the person you encounter out there isn't looking for a friendly conversation. It happened over the 4th of July weekend in 2025. I drove from Melbourne, Florida, to Charleston, South Carolina, to visit an old friend named Mark. I hadn't seen him in years. He was in Charleston for an internship related to his law program, and was staying at a house in the city. The drive was easy, and after I arrived, Mark and I spent the afternoon playing pickleball before night fell. Later that evening, I went downstairs and settled onto the couch near the windows. They looked out toward another apartment building, a network of narrow alleyways, and an abandoned house across the street. Nothing about the night seemed unusual. The next morning, Mark and I played more pickleball, hung out for a while, and eventually headed toward the main Charleston market. We walked through the crowded market and eventually made our way toward the docks by the water. That is where we saw him. A man was walking down the road wearing what looked like a wedding suit. He had a perfectly pressed suit, a neat bow tie, and clean dress shoes. His long, curly black hair stood out against his tan complexion, but it wasn't his appearance that caught our attention. It was the way he moved. The market behind us was loud and packed with people, yet this man seemed completely disconnected from everything around him. He walked alone on the opposite side of the street with a slow, almost mechanical shuffle. He didn't seem to notice anyone, and he certainly didn't seem to notice us. If Mark and I had crossed the street, we would have walked directly into him. Something about him immediately made me uncomfortable. So I grabbed Mark's arm and told him we weren't crossing. Instead, we went the other direction, deeper into the city, and picked up our pace. The man was moving slowly, so we quickly put some distance between us. I told Mark how strange the whole thing felt. The guy didn't look homeless. His clothes were far too clean and carefully put together. Everything about him seemed normal at first glance, but something about the way he carried himself felt deeply wrong. Mark agreed. We kept walking. A few streets later, while we were passing another busy area, we looked toward a shop, and there he was. The same man, same suit, same bow tie, same long, curly black hair, and the exact same slow, shambling walk. He was far down the street, moving diagonally across from us. We stopped and stared. There was no obvious way he could have gotten there so quickly without us seeing him. We had been walking at a faster pace, and yet somehow, he had appeared ahead of us in another part of the city. I pointed him out to Mark. Neither of us could explain it. Eventually, we decided to stop thinking about it and continued exploring Charleston. The following night was July 5th. We decided to take a ghost tour. Charleston was packed that Saturday night. The streets were filled with tourists and locals, and everywhere we went, people were moving in every direction. After the ghost tour ended, Mark and I were walking through one of the main areas of the city when a large group of people came toward us. Then I saw him. My stomach dropped. It was the same man. Again, same wedding suit, same bow tie, same black curly hair, same strange, slow shuffle. He was walking directly through the middle of the crowd as if he were completely separate from everyone around him. What made it even stranger was that nobody seemed to notice him. Two people were walking almost shoulder to shoulder with him. He slipped between them. Yet neither person reacted. The entire crowd moved normally around him. Everyone was walking at an ordinary pace. He wasn't. He kept moving with that same slow, unnatural rhythm we'd seen the previous day. Then, for just a moment, he looked directly at us. Mark and I looked at each other. Neither of us said anything. We watched as the man continued down the street. Eventually, the crowd began thinning. That was when we got another clear look at him. He was still moving exactly the same way. Slowly, steadily, he disappeared toward a darker side street. Then he turned a corner and vanished. Later that night, we went back to the house. Mark went upstairs to his room while I stayed downstairs to sleep. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. Tap. Something had touched the window. I froze. For several seconds, I didn't move. Then I slowly forced myself to look. I carefully raised the blinds just enough to see outside. The alley was mostly dark. At the far end, I caught sight of a man walking away. He was turning a corner. I knew immediately who it was. It was him. The same man, the same slow movement. I watched as he disappeared around the corner, but just before he vanished completely, he stopped. He turned his head and looked back toward the window. I dropped the blinds. The next morning, I told Mark exactly what had happened. Even he admitted that the whole experience was deeply disturbing. I still don't know who that man was, why we kept seeing him in places he shouldn't have been, or how he always seemed to appear ahead of us. But I'll never forget that weekend in Charleston, because sometimes the most unsettling things aren't the ones that attack you. They're the things you see repeatedly and can never explain. I never imagined I'd become the kind of person who checked the locks twice before going to bed. I never thought I'd memorize the sound of my own floorboards either. But 1 week last winter changed all of that. I live alone in a small house I bought a few years ago. My life was pretty uneventful. I worked from home, ordered groceries, and usually went to the gym late at night. Everything was routine then. One Tuesday morning, something changed. Around 2:30 a.m. I was half asleep on the couch with the television playing quietly when I heard a soft thump from the back of the house. It wasn't loud enough to immediately scare me. I figured something had fallen in the kitchen. I got up, checked the back door, confirmed that it was locked, and went to bed. The next morning, though, something about that door caught my attention. The deadbolt still worked normally, but the handle felt strange. Loose. Almost as if someone had twisted it with more force than necessary. I couldn't explain it, so I ignored it. That night, I went to the gym around 11 p.m. When I returned home at approximately 12:30 p.m. in the morning, I noticed something else. My porch light was off. I always left it on. For a moment, I stood in the driveway wondering if I'd somehow switched it off earlier and simply forgotten. That is what I told myself anyway. The following morning, I noticed another odd detail. My phone was down to 12% battery. That didn't make sense. I always charged it overnight, and I distinctly remembered plugging it in before going to sleep. The charging cable was still connected to my phone, but the charger itself had been unplugged from the outlet. At that point, I knew something strange was happening. I just didn't know what. That night, I stayed awake later than usual. I turned off the television and sat in the darkness listening to the house. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, slow, heavy thumps from somewhere near the back of the house. For a moment, I wondered if they were footsteps. I held my breath. Then the sound stopped. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the floor near the back door. They weren't clear enough to make out a complete shoe pattern. In fact, they looked almost smeared, as though someone had tried to wipe them away before walking farther into the house. My stomach dropped. I hadn't had anyone over. I checked the back door again. This time, I noticed faint scratches around the lock. They looked like someone had been trying to manipulate it with something thin. I called the locksmith and had the lock replaced. That night, I took even more precautions. I pushed a chair underneath the back door handle and locked my bedroom door before going to sleep, just before 4 a.m. I woke up. There was a sound on my bedroom door. Tap, tap. It wasn't a normal knock. It sounded like someone gently testing the door with their fingertips. I lay there listening. After about a minute, the tapping stopped. Then I heard quiet footsteps moving away. I didn't get up. I didn't open the door. I stayed in bed until morning. When I finally checked the house, the chair was still wedged beneath the back door handle. But the door itself was unlocked. The new lock hadn't been damaged. It had simply been turned from the inside. Someone had been inside my house while I was asleep. I called the police. They searched the house but found no obvious evidence of forced entry. Their explanation was that I might have unlocked the door myself and simply forgotten. I knew I hadn't. That night, I refused to go to sleep. I kept every light in the house on and sat with a kitchen knife on the table beside me. Around 2 a.m., I heard something downstairs. It was coming from the basement. I looked toward the basement door. It was slightly open. I walked over slowly and looked through the gap. At first, I could barely see anything. Then I noticed a shape. Someone was standing at the bottom of the stairs. I didn't stop to think. I slammed the door shut and ran straight outside to my car. From there, I called 911. The police arrived and searched the house. A few moments later, they brought a man outside in handcuffs. He was barefoot. He was wearing dark clothing. And he had been hiding in my basement behind the furnace. The officers discovered food wrappers and bottled water. They also found a phone charger plugged into one of the outlets. The man had apparently been living down there. He'd been sleeping directly on the concrete floor, using old insulation as padding. Suddenly, all those strange things made sense. The footsteps, the muddy prints, the unlocked door. The missing electricity from my phone charger, the noises in the middle of the night. Someone hadn't just broken into my house. He had been inside it while I was living there, sleeping there, watching. And I had no idea. A few days later, I was scrolling through the photos on my phone when I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a picture of me sleeping in my bed. I hadn't taken it. The timestamp said 3:11 a.m. It was taken on the same night my phone had mysteriously been unplugged. That was the moment the entire nightmare became real all over again. Because I realized the person hiding in my basement hadn't simply been living in my house. At some point, he had been close enough to my bed to photograph me while I slept. I've never been able to forget that, and to this day, I don't think I'll ever be comfortable going down into a basement alone at night again.